Hi biology students, this is Mrs. Miller again, and we're going to continue on with our ecology unit. Today we're talking about section 3, limits to ecosystems. In our previous videos, we've talked about the biosphere, we've talked about biomes, and a little bit with ecosystems. So where we're going to go now is we're going to move more into the communities and the populations. So we're going to be more on this level here. So population ecology is the study of how populations change and interact with their environment. So that's specifically where we're going to be looking now. The scientific goal of that is understanding the factors that influence the size of these populations. So why are some populations really large while other populations seem to be getting smaller? This allows scientists to better understand how to maintain population sizes, decrease pests, or increase endangered species populations. So are there specific areas where resources are available to certain organisms that they survive better, and can we make that happen in other areas? We know that life takes place in populations. A population is a group of individuals of the same species in the same area at the same time. So, an example of this would be the population of salmon in a specific river. So here we see this picture of all these salmon. So these salmon are all part of the same population. That is a different population of salmon that exist if we're looking at a different river. So it has to be that same location, same time as well. Populations do the following things. One is they're going to rely on the exact same resources. So whether that's biotic or abiotic, living or non-living things, they have to rely on those same things. They must be able to interact with one another. Obviously, we're going to see big interactions with these organisms. And they have to be able to interbreed with one another. So they have to be able to create more of those species. We know that there's two general factors that are going to influence population size, and that is going to be our biotic and our abiotic factors. So biotic factors, remember, are living organisms. So what food is available for those organisms? What predators exist in that area? If there's lots of predators, it's likely that we're going to have smaller populations of those prey animals for a little while. Abiotic factors, what are the non-living factors that influence them? So let's say we don't get a ton of light, or our amount of light is changing. Let's say the temperature is changing. A big one, of course, is water. What water is available that can affect the population size? If all of a sudden we go through a drought, we're probably going to see that many of those individuals within that population are not going to survive. So both of these together are going to influence how large or how small a population is going to be in a specific place. One important thing to know within an ecosystem is something called the habitat. So a single ecosystem can have many different habitats. Here we have one ecosystem and a ton of different habitats for these organisms. So the area where an ecosystem is going to be living is that habitat, and the habitat includes the abiotic and the biotic factors, and these determine how the organisms survive in the ecosystem. So when we look at this habitat, we have our freshwater habitat, we have all of our water, we have the organisms that can live, like our ducks that can live in the water or outside of it. We have our organisms that live within the soil, so that would be a different habitat. We have organisms that burrow down into the soil, different habitat. We have other organisms like a beaver that can make itself a dam. Habitats could be in the trees. So there are so many different habitats within that ecosystem, which is why we have so much biodiversity or variety to the life that lives there. Habitat and niche are going to be two different things. Habitat is the area where that organism lives, but a niche is like that organism's occupation or what it's going to do within that habitat. So a niche is the range of abiotic and biotic factors in which an organism lives and the way in which it uses these resources. So that's the big part that makes a niche different than a habitat. The habitat is the abiotic and biotic factors in which it lives, but the niche also includes how it's going to use these factors to survive. So it includes a place in the food web, and also could be like an ideal temperature range where it's going to live, a specific location where it's going to live, and then the biotic and abiotic factors also determine the number of niches per ecosystem. So if we're looking at this specific tree, we can see that in the bottom here, this warbler, this yellow rumped warbler, is going to live on the bottom. So that's its specific niche. The next one up is going to be in the middle of the tree because that's where it specifically lives. And then the Cape May warbler is going to be up on the top. The niche is going to include quite a few things, including the type of food the organism eats, how it gets it, what it preys on, the physical conditions required to survive, how and when it reproduces, and things like that. So when we look at the food, if we're looking at this bullfrog, the food it needs to catch insects, worms, spiders, small fish, or maybe even mice, depending on how big the bullfrog is. It does have certain predators. Herons could eat it. Raccoons or other bullfrogs can actually eat the bullfrog, especially when we're thinking about tadpoles. So it has specific prey items and specific predators. The physical conditions required to survive. So when we look at what they need to spend most of their life either in or near water that includes ponds or lakes. So if there is no water available to it, that would not be a good place for a bullfrog to live. The body temperature varies with the surroundings of the water and the air, so it probably doesn't want to get super, super cold. Otherwise, it might not be able to survive. What happens is when it does get cold, the bullfrog needs to burrow into the mud in order to hibernate. So if it doesn't have these conditions met, it's not going to survive. Also, we need to look at how it reproduces. The female bullfrogs will lay their eggs in water during the warmer months of the year, so probably spring to summer. And then the tadpoles are going to live in the water until their legs and lungs develop. If they don't have access to water that long, or if there's predators that are going to be eating them, it's going to be harder for them to survive. The biggest thing I want you guys to understand about the niche is that no two species can share the exact same niche in the same habitat. That would be too much competition, and one of them would be kicked out of that particular ecosystem. So you might still have other organisms that need to be in the water and that need water in order to reproduce, but they couldn't have the exact same food requirements then for this bullfrog. Otherwise, the two organisms would compete too much and they wouldn't survive. The next thing we're going to talk about is characterizing a population. So when we hear about populations, oftentimes we're explaining where these are going to exist, how close they are, and the general size of that population. So when we talk about the ranges of a species is the geographic area within which the species can be found. And then the population density is a measure of the number of organisms that make up a population in a defined area. So over here we have a range for an animal, and as you can see, it is going to be all in this area. So on the eastern side of the United States, going from all the way up north to all the way into part of the Florida Panhandle. And you can see in certain areas for this specific animal, there's going to be different population densities. So they could exist in this whole area, but it's very likely that you will find a lot of them in this area where it's pink, and just a very, very few in the area where it's more of this light blue. So that whole area is their range. The different colors is what we call their population density. Now that you guys have a basic understanding of what the population is, where it's going to be living, the habitat versus the niche, we also need to understand that as these populations exist, there's going to be some changes. Most populations experience changes, especially in the size of that population over time. Some thrive, some don't survive very well at all. So populations can change with 4 major events, and that would be births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. Obviously, births and deaths is one of the number one things that we're going to be looking at. So as we have more births, we're going to be increasing the total population. And then as we have more deaths, that's going to cause a decrease in that population. Immigration and emigration is also important to understand how these populations are changing. Immigration is the movement of an individual into an area. So here we have this white goose. It is immigrating into this area with all the brown geese. Okay, so it's coming into the population, it's immigrating. Emigration is where we have individuals move out of the population. So here we had one of the white geese that emigrated out, and then it immigrated into a new one. There are many possible reasons why we see this immigration or emigration. Probably the number one thing is that we see individuals seeking out mates, especially when you think about lions or you think about wolves. They usually have one dominant male, so the males tend to emigrate out of their population to seek out mates. There might be shortages of available food. So if there isn't enough food in Wisconsin to have the white-tailed deer feed, they're going to start moving out into other areas. It could be because of habitat destruction. We're seeing this oftentimes with our tropical rainforests. So they're losing that spot, so they're forced to emigrate out of that area. But another really, really common one is we see those seasonal migration patterns. So whether that's birds or butterflies, we're going to see a lot of seasonal migration where they're going to emigrate out of an area and then they come back and immigrate after the winter season has passed. The one thing that happens with populations is at a certain point they reach the maximum amount of resources that can be taken out. So all ecosystems have a set amount of resources, whether that's food, shelter, water, whatever it is. The amount of those resources available can change from year to year. So you might have a drought one year or you might have a lot of rain the next. And that usually depends on the weather patterns, human activity, and natural disasters like tornadoes or hurricanes, things like that. But regardless, we have something called a carrying capacity. So a carrying capacity is the largest number of individuals of a population that an environment can support. If there are more organisms in the ecosystem than resources available, organisms are going to start to die. So here we see an organism's population in like the maroony purple color. So what we see is once they're in a new ecosystem, all of a sudden we see this exponential growth because they're able to use the resources. Then we overshoot. The overshoot is where we have too many organisms and not enough resources to support them. So then we see a crash in that particular population. Now we go below what we call that carrying capacity. And now we get more, and now we overshoot again. And you can see how it's a constant battle of overshooting and then being under the carrying capacity that causes these organisms to keep changing their population size. Once carrying capacity has been met, you can see the changes aren't nearly as big as that initial overshoot is. If you guys have any questions, let us know. Otherwise, have a great day.